was a little stressed how I was going to move a table, hold 2 bottles of water, my Bible, and my notebook all at one time. But looky there. I did it. We didn't think through all of that. And so I'm so excited to be here with you. It is my honor to be here, to be the first speaker of the gathering. But like I said, our hope and our dream is that this will be one of many gatherings that we're going to have. And one of the things that we have kind of been focusing on, at least at our promotion, is wildflowers. And I don't know if you noticed, but in kind of the promotion that we started doing, it was a bouquet of wildflowers. And we're going to be talking a little bit about wildflowers today. And it's just been so cool how even just that song that Jen and the band chose to sing right before this, and her even talking about our uniqueness before the Lord, is exactly what I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of this message. I went to a retreat this weekend that was phenomenal, and so I'm all fired up. So who knows, we may be here all night. But one of the things that she said is, how many of you in here feel like you don't exactly fit? And it was surprising how many people raised their hand that something about them made them feel like they didn't fit. And the fact of it is, all of us are unique, right? We just read that scripture about how God has created each one of us unique. And I was walking through Hobby Lobby, and I saw this sign that said, "In a world full of roses, be a wildflower." Is that sign up there? Yeah, perfect. So I see now where that monitor is. In a world full of roses, be a wildflower. And I thought it was funny because it's a sign that you actually hang, I believe, in a little girl's room, because they kind of had it with the little girl stuff. And it reminded me that this weekend, one of the speakers had named her child Wild. You heard me right, W-I-L-D. And then she remarked of how surprised she was that he was what? Wild. Absolutely. I did the same thing. I named my son Caleb, which means dogged and determined, and then was super surprised that he was strong-willed. So I thought it was kind of interesting that somebody would put that in their little girl's bedroom because parenting a wildflower may not be easy. Right? Because the difference between a wildflower and a rose, and you may not know this, so this is going to be a little gardening lesson for you. The difference between a rose and a wildflower is that a rose is cultivated by man. A rose, you have to do a lot of things to it to keep it alive. Those of us who grow roses know this. We have to fertilize it, we have to prune it, we have to do all these things to it, where wildflowers just grow naturally. And if you have been to Israel with me, probably one of the more annoying things that I do is instead of taking pictures of all the archaeological things around, I take pictures of flowers. And so wherever we are, and it's always amazing to me, the beautiful flowers that are just growing out in the fields in Israel, and then we just recently did a trip, a Steps of Paul trip, and just amazing the flowers that just grow naturally. And so I was kind of doing a deep dive on this whole wildflower idea, and back in the Victorian day, people would give they would give flowers, and every flower had a meaning. Did you know this? Like, what are roses? What do roses mean? Love is normally what roses mean, and certain color roses, right, mean certain things. And so I'm going to share with you some of what I discovered because I thought it was really very interesting. So the first one is a garden daisy. Now, we see these all the time, and so this is a good one if, like, a little boy or a boy tells a girl, that I like you. The little girl could give him garden daisies, which means I share your sentiment. So basically, I feel the same thing about you that you feel about me. And so there's another wildflower called sorrel, and this one is you would give to somebody. Maybe you would take it to somebody's house and lay it on their doorstep, and it means affection. I feel affection to you. Now, I also found this one interesting is hope. It's the wildflower hawthorn. It's actually a tree that's also considered a wildflower, and you would give this to somebody if you wanted to give them hope, or you had hope, you would give it to them. And then this is one of my favorite flowers. How many of y'all love the poppy, the red poppy? Now, how many of y'all have ever noticed that sometimes the royals, right, Princess Kate and all of them, what do they wear? They wear a red poppy on them. And I don't know if you know that the reason they wear that is they wear it on certain days as a remembrance of soldiers that have died. And so the poppy means consolation, which to me is so interesting because if I was to name for you one of the happiest looking flowers, to me it would be a poppy, but it actually means consolation. And so that would be a good one to send, I guess, to a funeral, right? Would be a poppy. But there are some wildflowers that you'd want to be really careful that no one leaves on your doorstep. For example, if somebody puts some tansies on your doorstep, this is a real thing, I promise you, look it up. If someone puts tansies on your doorstep, what they're really telling you is, I declare war on you. And it's funny that that is one of the flowers that's pretty easy to find that a lot of florists use in decorating and in floral arrangements, is that tansy. And so I thought that was really funny that that is not one you'd want to send to someone. But believe it or not, there's one worse than that, and that is the hemlock. The hemlock means you will be my death. I don't know about you, sometimes I felt like giving that to my kids, right? On really hard days, you will be my death. And so there's a Bible verse we're going to look up, or you don't have to look it up. I'm going to put it on the screen there for you. Matthew 6:28, and Jesus is talking about flowers. Now, don't throw rocks at me. I'm using the Good News Translation here. If you know, everything else I'm going to use tonight is ESV. But I did think it was super interesting that in the Matthew, in Good News Translation, it says this, and why worry about clothes? Look how the wildflowers grow. They do not work or make clothes for themselves. But I tell you that not even King Solomon, with all of his wealth, had clothes as beautiful as one of these flowers. Now, some of us worry about clothes more than others, right? But if you look a little deeper into this, what the flower is really worrying about is how it looks to the outside. What is its appearance? Because it says, really, the clothes are what we put on, and it's how the world sees us. And I think what Jesus is saying here is that each flower has a beauty of its own, that God is really in charge of that. And I think one of the things is I came into, if you don't know my story, you're going to hear it tonight. You're going to know more about me than you want to. And one of the things is I didn't feel like everybody else. I definitely felt different. I hadn't grown up in church. I didn't know all the music. And especially as a pastor's wife, I really felt at a disadvantage that I was super unique and different than everyone else and didn't fit in. I tried hard to fit in, but I always felt like I was a little bit different. And God has just really been speaking to my heart about embracing how we're different, embracing our uniqueness. And you know, it's interesting in a room like this, they said this weekend, and it's so true, that there probably will never be another moment like this one. it would be very difficult for us to bring this exact combination of people all together in this room at one time. And each one of us are super unique, not just in personality, right? But in our story, how God has layered in all the layers of our story that have brought us to this point right now. And I love that uniqueness. And just a couple things that in my research of wildflowers, I, again, know way more than you probably want to know, is that wildflowers, unlike roses and other cultivated plants, are resilient and strong. They weather storms much better than all the other plants do that are cultivated. Isn't that interesting? By the way, the definition of cultivated, I think it was on my very first slide, is that man doesn't have to do anything. You're kind of naturally made. And in what I'm trying to draw the comparison to is that God has made you a certain way. And sometimes men, women, right, have tried to make you into something maybe that God didn't even want you to be. And so each one of you are unique. And you know what? If you truly are leaning into that, it'll make you more resilient and able to stand up for storms. It's interesting that wildflowers, roses steal nutrients out of the soil, but wildflowers are actually better for the soil and the ground with them than without. Do y'all hear what that means? Like, we are better for where we are. We don't steal nutrients from where we are. We add in nutrients. I love that when storms come, some wildflowers, you know what they do? They close their petals when a storm comes to make them more resilient to the storm. And one of the other things is they grow in unexpected places. One of the places that we've been is Petra, and it is dry, dry, dry. No rain, dry and rocky. And guess what's everywhere? Little wildflowers. Do you have that picture? These are real pictures that I've taken that are just amazing to me because there's nothing else green by it. And then there'll be this just phenomenal flower right there. And they grow in unexpected places. There's even Death Valley. I thought this was really funny. In Death Valley, think about this. Who wants to live? And what kind of flower would want to live in Death Valley? But the best time to go to Death Valley is when all the wildflowers are blooming because they're absolutely beautiful there in the desert. And they're also symbolize freedom and who God has made them. They grow together and create this beautiful tapestry. I love one of the things that I have to always remember is that God has made me uniquely who I am. So let's say I'm a poppy. I love poppies. I don't need to aspire to be a sunflower, right? God's uniquely made me who he wanted me to be. And the beauty of it is when they all grow together, like in a whole, what would you call that? A field. That's what it's called, a field. They grow together, and that mixture of the colors just creates this beauty. And I have a couple pictures there. It's the pink, there's one of the poppies, and then there's one of the yellow and the purple flowers together that you can hardly see the purple flowers there, but they're so pretty, and they're just growing everywhere. One of the mustard is actually a wildflower. I mean, it was just amazing when I was doing this research, and it's just growing everywhere. It's a certain type of mustard, so not cultivated. And so when many of you probably don't know my story at all. It's been a long time since I've shared it. And the women in my Bible study hear this a lot, but one of the things that attracted me really study the Bible and know it is because I didn't grow up in church. I didn't grow up with anybody teaching me anything about God. In fact, it's really interesting. My dad grew up Christian Science. My mom grew up very Roman Catholic. And so they had had super bad experiences with religion. And so when they got married, and they were not able to have a child, and so I'm adopted. That's a whole testimony of me finding my birth mom and all that, but that's a whole different story for another day. But they decided that they were going to raise me without religion, which is so interesting to me because as a Christian, and I've been so strong about wanting to raise my children to know Jesus, but they were very purposeful that they didn't want me to feel any forcing to religion at all. So the result of that was that I didn't know anything about Jesus at all. I tell people that the very first time I ever heard the gospel was when I was 18 years old. And people find that really hard to believe that someone could grow up today in America and not hear the gospel, but it happens all the time. And I know maybe today there's more radio and media around, but I honestly had no idea that Easter had anything to do with Jesus and a cross. I don't know how that's possible, but I promise you it is possible. I grew up in a pretty happy home, though. My parents spoiled me because I was an only child, as most only children are spoiled. And grew up, I worked hard at school. I worked hard at things that I put my hand to. And by the time I got to high school, life was going well. I'd never heard anything, so I didn't really think spiritual thoughts, to be honest with you. I just kind of took life at a very surface value. And I was a cheerleader in high school and finished up my junior year. I wanted to go to Stetson University. Anybody here from Stetson? Anybody? No? In Florida? Usually there's someone. But I'd wanted to go to Stetson, which I don't know if any of you know, Stetson was a Christian school. It was started as a Christian school, and of course now it's very far away from that. And but I wanted to go to Stetson. They had a good law school there and wanted to go to law school, wanted an accounting degree, and in particular wanted to be a tax lawyer. And so I had gotten accepted to Stetson based on my work up to my junior year, and in fact had even won, going into my senior year, this award called Pathfinder. Sounds important, doesn't it? And it was given by the Palm Beach Post. That's where I grew up, is South Florida, in a little town called Jupiter. And it was given by the Palm Beach Post for certain leaders in certain categories. So they gave it in arts, and they gave it in certain ones. And I had won it that year for business. I'm not bragging. That's going to come into the story later, I promise. And so things were going really well going into my senior year. And my friends had all decided that they were going to go on a caravan trip up to Gainesville. I couldn't think if it was down or up, but I'm in South Florida, so it was up. And they were coming to Gainesville for a football game. And I did not go at the last minute. A decision was made for me not to go with them. And I had contemplated going, decided not to go. And my very best friend, Michelle, at the time, she ended up driving her car and coming. And it was about a 5 or 6 car caravan. And they made a very bad choice and started drinking when they left. They had all met together at the beach and started drinking as they drove on the caravan. So you can imagine by the time they had gotten to Ocala, that Michelle, who was driving, was intoxicated along with a lot of the other drivers and passengers in these cars. And it was also strangely a time where a tropical depression was coming across the state, so the weather was super bad. And this is 1984, September of 1984, September 29th, if you want the exact date. And as they were coming in, they were right before Payne's Prairie. We have no idea what happened, but Michelle lost control of the car and crossed across the median, and an 18-wheeler hit them. And there were 4 girls, all cheerleaders, in the car, and all with varying different degrees of injuries. One was killed at the scene. Her name was Mary, and Mary was sitting right behind Michelle, just a great girl. And then there were 2 other girls in the car. And Michelle, the car caught fire after it was hit, and so Michelle had 3rd-degree burns on 40% of her body. And then one other girl was in critical condition, and then one other actually came through the accident pretty well. Unfortunately, one of the terrible things is because this was a caravan, there were all those kids right there at the scene quickly. And it was interesting. I was rereading the newspaper article about the accident that was in the Gainesville newspaper, which was so interesting because it wasn't my newspaper at the time, and their report on the accident. It was interesting. That was one of the things that they mentioned in it as well. So Michelle had major brain damage and, of course, had the burns on her body. And so she was transferred to Shands Burn Unit, and that's where she was. She was in a coma actually till Thanksgiving Day. So that's September 29th, so she was in a coma for about 2 months. And during that time, I made lots of trips to Gainesville. I would come up usually on a bus and stay there at the burn unit, play her favorite music to her, talk to her, that type of thing. And then often I would sleep on the floor at the Ronald McDonald House where her parents were staying, and then try to hitch a ride from somebody else. It really was during this time, though, during those trips and that time sitting at her hospital bed, that I finally started thinking about death and the afterlife and whether there was a God. And unfortunately, Mary, who was in the car and was killed, if you were to ask me whether Mary was a Christian, I would probably say no, and that just truly breaks my heart. She was part of a church that actually I had gone to some lock-ins with her. And do you believe that they would have a lock-in and have all those teenagers there and never say the name of Jesus? And that's exactly what happened at a church. And indeed, even at her funeral, there was very few, if any, mention to a God. And so it was a horrible time in my life. There was a football game, strange enough, the very next Friday. And I think I told you all 4 girls in the accident were cheerleaders. And so the team we were playing was called Twin Lakes High School, and their cheerleaders came to Mary's funeral. And we just thought that was just the sweetest thing, that act of support. And then we played them that Friday. Well, here we were all the cheerleaders, but we didn't feel like cheering, that's for sure. We're super sad. And but we really did our best, and it was sweet. At halftime, the Twin Lakes cheerleaders came over. They had a rose for each one of us, and they gave us a rose. And then one of the girls on the Twin Lakes cheerleading squad said, "Can I pray for you guys?" And we're all like, "What, prayer?" None of us knew anything about Jesus. I don't know what was going on in Jupiter in the 80s, but none of us knew anything about Jesus. And so this girl, her name was Deborah. I didn't know that at the time. But we were like, "Sure, you can pray for us." So they joined hands, and prayed for us. And Deborah led that prayer. And I remember even looking at her as she was praying, because I wasn't really shutting my eyes. And I was kind of looking at her like, what an odd thing to do. Like, that's so brave. It was very interesting to me, and I didn't forget it. Ironically enough, I think I told you what a dark time it was for me personally in my life. And ironically, the Twin Lake cheerleaders were in an accident in January. So that was September. Fast forward to January. Very different accident. Their cheerleading sponsor was actually driving the van that they were in, and she took a, whatever that thing is that you come off of the highway on, too fast and rolled the van. And Deborah was the only girl killed in the accident of all the cheerleaders. And so those Twin Lake cheerleaders had come to our football game and had been so sweet and supportive to us. So we decided that we would do the same, and we went to her funeral, which was at First Baptist West Palm. And it was the first time that I ever heard the gospel. And I'll never forget sitting up in the balcony that's still there today and hearing the gospel for the very first time. And I'd love to tell you that it just gave me warm fuzzies, and I thought, yes, this is what I want to do. I want to commit my life to Jesus, and that was how the story ended. But it wasn't. It made me furious what Jack Graham was saying. He was preaching her funeral. Deborah had committed her life to missions. She was really going to be a world changer. And I just thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever heard, that he was manipulating everybody in the funeral by trying to make sense of such a tragic situation. And we left that funeral, and I remember walking down the stairs of the outside, walking down, and I was cussing out loud. And my cheerleading coach saying to me, because that's who we went with, Sarah, keep your voice down. People are going to hear you. And I said, I don't care who hears me. And so angry at that truth that I had heard. It didn't make any sense to me how that could be true, and I had not ever heard it. Which, by the way, people that you share Jesus with today sometimes have that same exact feeling. Has anybody gotten angry at you when you've shared the gospel with them? Don't be afraid of that. That's not a bad response. At least it means they're considering the seriousness of it. Because if something makes you mad, guess what? You're actually thinking about it, right? It's people who don't act like they care at all that you should be nervous about. And so that really started getting my mind going, thinking through this crazy truth that I had heard. And I had really bottomed out for a lot of reasons. And Stetson got my fall of my senior year grades. And they said, you are not accepted now. You were accepted, now you're not accepted. And they said, you know what? Why don't you just stay and do 2 years at a community college? And I said, I'm not going to do 2 years at a community college. And they said, well, there's this school down there called Palm Beach Atlantic, and they have a lot of the same requirements, and you can just go there. That'd be a good place for you to go. And so just, I would say randomly, but with God, there is nothing random. The admissions counselor at PBA had decided to cold call the people who had won that Pathfinder scholarship that I told you about earlier. And he was just calling through that list and called me. Most everybody had somewhere to go to school because they hadn't failed out of their fall semester of their high school career. And so when they got a hold of me, I said, actually, I have no other options right at the moment. And he said, why don't you come down and talk to me? And I did. And I literally sat on this couch that he had in his admissions office, and I said, do you let atheists come to the school? And he said, yes. And I said, good, because I'm an atheist. I don't even think I really knew what that meant. And we talked about the different things, how I had to take Bible classes and all of that, and that I had to go to chapel. And I said, do I have to listen in chapel? And I'll never forget, he said, no one can make you listen. And man, is that true, right? And so I didn't have a lot of options. And they even gave me money to come. It was crazy. And so he went home and told his brother and his sister-in-law about me. And their names are Joe and Deborah Dickerson. And he said something about that girl. I just think God has a purpose for her, and we're going to play a part in it. Is that not so cool? And Joe and Deborah said, you know what? We're going to pray for her. It'll be so cool to see what happens. We're going to start praying for her. And so they did. They started praying for me. And about a month later, they called me from PBA and said, is there anything you need? I said, I need a job, because my parents are all on me about making money. And he said, you know what? I have a job for you, too. And he gave me a job working right next to his sister-in-law, Deborah. And Deborah shared the gospel with me every chance she got, and bought me my first Bible. I would sometimes feel, spunky, so I would go in and I would try to say shocking things to Deborah to try to get her to not like me. And it never worked. And I would come in and I would ask her all these super hard questions, like, if it was just Noah and his family in the ark and they populated the whole earth, does that mean God agrees with incest? Like, these were the questions I was bringing her. And so she never missed a beat, though. She was so gracious, and sometimes she would say, I'm not exactly sure, but I'll look into it. But the most important thing I want you to know is that God loves you, and he loves you just how you are, but he doesn't want to leave you where he finds you. He wants you to walk with him and surrender to him. And that beauty that she showed inside and out was captivating to me and slowly started changing my heart. There was a Christian guy who came into my life around this time. It's funny, I broke up with him because he wasn't a spiritual leader 9 months after we started dating. And the sweetest part of that story is I said to him, how could you say that you loved me if you didn't care I was going to hell? That's what I said to him. Because he was a Christian kid who had gone to college, and he thought it would be fun to date the non-Christian, right? So he was dating me, and after I came to Christ, I was like, you should not have even been dating me. What were you doing? Like, you shouldn't be dating me. But it's all part of my story that he was. And his parents were coming into town, so I wanted to make a really good impression. So we went to church, back at that same church, First Baptist West Palm. And it was interesting, something about the way he was preaching and everything. And I had really been studying the Bible on my own, and God was really starting to do a work in my life. And it was just, I wanted to keep going back. And of course, he did not want to go to church on Sunday mornings. But I would drag him to church with me on Sunday mornings. Y'all are questioning whether he really was a Christian, I know. But I would make him go to church with me, and I would be asking him all these questions. He's like, I don't know. Let's go ask somebody else. And I would ask Deborah. And Deborah would tell me, she would say, I just want you to know that every morning my husband and I pray for you. And, those of you who've been praying for someone to come to Christ, I'd love to tell you that was like 6 months. It was 18 months she put up with me and prayed for me. And 18 months later, finally at an Easter performance, it was interesting that y'all sang that song because one of the things that was, they had Jesus on the cross, as all Easter shows do, right? And they were singing a song about God knowing our name. And I later got to know the actor who was playing Jesus. And in the program, he would just be saying names during it. And he said my name when I was there. And I was like, all right, that's it. That's all I need. Like, God, I had been asking for a sign from God, and that was a sign enough for me. And I probably did the whole sinner's prayer about 3 or 4 times that night just to make sure it stuck. Because when I was super in. And really for me, I had known all of those facts because Deborah had been sharing all of that with me. But it really was all about surrender. It was really about, I remember I walked forward to the song, I Surrender All. Remember that when we used to sing that at invitations? And that song is such a good visual of literally you surrendering all of yourself to him. And I remember how meaningful that was for me. But here's the thing, life moves on. I became a Christian, felt called to ministry very quickly after. In fact, I had to have people write a note for me that they would let me in seminary because I hadn't been a Christian long enough to even go. And met my incredible husband there. And he had grown up completely different, had grown up with a pastor as a kid, as a dad. And so we added a lot to each other's life and understanding. But you can understand, I literally, when I got saved at, 19 years old, I went to seminary 18 months later. And the rule was you had to be a Christian for 2 years back in that day. And I was still learning very fundamental things. It was funny, right after I got saved in April. And Deborah, this is so cool. I called Deborah the very next morning. And she picked up the phone, and like her home phone, because back then we didn't have anything else, young people. And she picked up her phone and she said, did you accept Jesus last night? And I said, yes. How did you know? She said, I just had a feeling when I got out of bed this morning and I prayed for you that something had happened. And she said, let's meet. And so she gave me the Campus Crusade book. I mean, literally, she had me sharing Jesus on the street corner 6 weeks later. I mean, intensive discipleship. She had me in the Word, with all the Campus Crusade, like one of their books, and it was really special. And it was such a great thing because there were lots of things that I was still kind of pulling along with me, habits, thought patterns, lots of sin still in my life that didn't just miraculously go away the night I got saved. And yet, I would come to her and I'd say, I don't think I have to give that up. I think I'm going to keep doing that. And she would say, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. God's in charge of you now. She'd say, God will work with you. And I'd say, oh, don't say that, because every time you say that, God comes and convicts me of those very things. And so I just want to share with you really quickly that act of surrender that happens to you when you get saved is the same act of surrender that needs to continue throughout your life. Because now I think some of us have been Christians a long time. There are things that we struggle with surrendering. And I heard this quote, I loved it. Maintaining status quo can't be our highest priority. And there have been many times in life where I've been super okay, I'm at a good point, God. Leave me alone, right? And God wants to come in and cause further growth. In fact, one of our values at Westside is growth over status quo. And man, I believe that as it relates to the church. But think about that in your own life. Do you really want growth over status quo? Because I don't know about you, status quo is super comfortable. And there's this great passage in Jeremiah, and we're going to talk about the passage in Jeremiah first. And let me just read it to you. I'm really in trouble because I'm only halfway through. You're like, oh yeah, you are in trouble because we're not staying for the whole thing. All right, so Jeremiah, let me just read this to you. Jeremiah says in 18, verse 1, he says, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, arise and go down to the potter's house. There I will let you hear my words. So Jeremiah went down to the potter's house, and there he, the potter, was working at his wheel. And the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand. And instead of just throwing it away, look what the potter did. And the potter reworked it into another vessel as it seemed good to the potter to do. Then the word of the Lord came to me, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, declares the Lord. Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so you are in my hand, O house of Israel. And what God is saying to Jeremiah here is there are times in our lives, and there were times in Israel where he said, the way you're going is not good. In fact, I'm going to rework the clay completely and make it into a completely different vessel than the one it started off to be. And I don't know about you, but that is not always an easy process, right? The being reworked. And there's this great passage in Isaiah, and it's up there, that I had never noticed before, that in Isaiah 64:8, it says, and yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are the potter. We're all formed by your hand. What do you notice in this passage that was different in Jeremiah is it identifies who the potter is. And who is the potter? Our Father, right? Doesn't that change everything for you? I guess it would depend on if you had a good relationship with your father or not. But if you were to understand what a good, good Father our God is, that he, as the Father, is the one who is molding and shaping us, that he has good, good hands. And one part of my story I've left out for years and years and years. So fast forward to 2014, David came home and said, in fact, he was like, hey, come upstairs for a minute while I change. And so I went upstairs, and he said, I got a call today. Now, it wasn't unusual for a church to randomly call him and ask if he was possibly interested in leaving. We didn't have a resume or anything, but it just kind of happens in church life that's kind of what happens. And so it wasn't unusual because we had had a couple others. In fact, one was kind of close to here down in Jacksonville, so it wouldn't be incredibly unusual. But he said to me, it was so interesting. I mean, I can remember exactly where I was standing. He said, it was from a church in Gainesville. And I remember looking at him, and I was like, I'm not going. He said, I know. And I looked at him, I said, you would not ask me to go to Gainesville, would you? No, I wouldn't ask you to do that. And I said, God would not ask me to go to Gainesville. And he said, I'm sure he wouldn't. And you may be like, what in the world is your problem? How could just that accident have caused you not to like the city too much? Well, part of my story that I don't share a lot is that I had come 4 weeks prior to that accident. And the reason I didn't come the second time was because of the trip the first time. And lots of places in this story you can feel judgment, but I'll just leave that with you. We had a lot of friends who'd come to UF, as a lot of times seniors do. And I was dating somebody. I had a boyfriend at the time who was older than me, so he was already out of high school, and a lot of his best friends were here at the university. So we came in August for Rush Week, a group of us, much smaller group, but I came with a boyfriend and a few friends. And we had come for Rush Week, and we were here at a fraternity house. We had started, in fact, one of a really good friend of ours was really involved in one of the fraternity houses, and that's kind of where we started the night at. And then we were kind of like going down to the different fraternity houses. And so we were visiting at one of those fraternity houses, and like lots of teenagers do, a boyfriend and I got in an argument. And I said, I'm not going with you anymore. Like, I'm staying here. And being a little rebellious to the situation. So you can feel judgment for that, lots of judgment. But so I said, I'm staying right here. He said, fine, you stay here, I'm leaving. And so that's exactly what happened. I kind of found myself there by myself at that fraternity house. And a guy came over to me and said what all young women know not to accept. He said, do you want me to go grab you a drink? And I said, sure, yeah, that's great. Like, I'm mad at boyfriend, that sounds good. I had only had one other thing to drink that night as far as alcoholic beverages are concerned. And so I was not drunk. And he went, got me the drink. I can remember exactly where I was sitting, totally full functioning mind, until 2 hours later, I woke up. And back in the day, the whole drug thing was not as prevalent, but it definitely was on the uptick. And something had been put in my drink that completely incapacitated me. And when I woke up, at least 2 hours had gone by, and I knew that I had been sexually assaulted during that time. And I knew that something really bad had happened to me, and so kind of in a whole like dreamy, kind of incoherent state type of thing. Oh, that's my earring hitting the thing. Sorry, that's annoying. I ended up finding my way back to where my friends would have been, I thought, and that was back at the fraternity house that was right next door to this fraternity house, because again, we had just started. And of course, they had been on a terrible search for me, didn't know where I was. And they were there waiting for me. And I definitely knew something terrible had happened to me, and I was trying to explain my story to them. And it turned into just this huge pain and hurt in my life. And, it's so funny. Today, I was sharing with my Bible study that, like, one of my Achilles heel is this idea of feeling misunderstood. And I think that's what is so painful so many times about sexual assault, is that you really are so misunderstood. And it was interesting, again, I don't know why I did this to myself, I was kind of reading through newspaper articles about my own incident. And there were some things written in there that just made me so mad 30-something odd years later. 40 years later, I'm so old. And assumptions that we make. And they tested I went to the hospital, had all the testing done. They picked up that drug immediately in my blood. And None of that, of course, is reported in the newspapers. Just a lot of judgment and misunderstanding. And I don't want to go really far into this, but I do want to say we need to be really careful as the church that we don't propagate any of that, and that we're a place that people find a soft place and not more judgment. And I think the church has sometimes done a disservice in their leaning into modesty to make women feel like the things that have happened to them are their fault. And that somehow the way we dress, somehow we are responsible for a man's sin, and we're not. And so, with that phone call in 2014, came all of a sudden, this revelation that God wanted to use something of mine that I was not willing to surrender. And it was interesting. David has always known my story. It was something I told him very early on. And but nobody else knew, not even my best friends, my in-laws. Nobody knew, except my old friends. Everybody knew. Gossip, get a little gossip in a small town. And so as soon as we got that call from this church, I was like, oh, man, I do not want that to be part of my life. I'm really, really comfortable with that staying where it is. And I realized that it couldn't be a coincidence why God was drawing me here. And we felt drawn here. And so sometimes, especially in my early days, if I acted like I didn't love Gainesville, maybe you'll give me a little grace on that. It really was such a healing process, though, for me to be here and to love this place. I did some things I went and kind of walked around the place like I was somehow back in control of that. Like I literally marched around the fraternity house. It was really good for me to do that I had control over that situation. But here's what I know about God through the whole thing. And so here's the thing, let me say this too, is that a lot of people think that I don't want to share this part of my story because I'm embarrassed or I feel shame, which there is some accuracy there, but it's probably not for the reason you think. One of the things that is part of my personality is that I don't like anybody to feel sorry for me or to feel like I'm a victim in any way. So this part of my story made me feel so vulnerable. I don't mind people knowing that I've done things wrong, but the very last thing I wanted was for anybody to feel sorry for me or feel like I was a victim. And so I was saying goodbye to all of our Atlanta friends, and wasn't really sure how God was going to unfold all of this, but I thought, there's no way I cannot not tell my very best friends my story. And so I said, all right, girls, I've got something to share. And I unpacked my story for them and told it publicly for the very first time. And there is one crazy thing that this makes me emotional, but one of my very best friends that had been just so close with me had really been brutally raped and had never told anybody. And had not told her husband and was really suffering that many years later. And when I began to share my story, she got this really weird look on her face. And I said to her, are you mad at me? What about my story? And she just came unglued, and it was just such this healing time, such a healing time for her and her husband as she kind of unpacked all of that. And she said that this was the one place that I wasn't going to let God ever touch. And it just really affirmed in me that I was hearing God correctly, that he wanted all of me, every piece of it. And so I knew coming to Gainesville that that would be part of my ministry. And I've just had college pastors here have known, most of all the pastors here know my story. So I've had just this incredible privilege of meeting with lots of young women. And it's such a privilege and honor to do that. But here's what God taught me in the hands of all of that, is that God has good hands and he does beautiful work. That there was something beautiful, even about that very ugliest part of my story, that he wanted to use. And it really came down to surrender again, just like it did the day I accepted Christ. Was I willing to surrender everything to the potter's hand? Everything, every piece of me, and not hold anything back. And if you think about what our greatest goal for most of us, if I was to go around this room and I would ask you, what is your goal in life? Many of you would say it would be to bring God glory, to be a vessel of glory. And here's the thing, just like we read in Jeremiah and Isaiah, sometimes he has to break us to make us better vessels of glory. And none of that is fun, by the way. And it's so interesting. I have so much to say about this, but I'm letting you go home. That so many times we think pressure is a bad thing. But if you think about how the potter is pressing in on that clay, it takes pressure to yield something beautiful. So often what we feel is great discomfort during that time. But our highest priority cannot be keeping status quo. And all of you have different stories. I started the whole thing by saying that you're unique. Nobody has my unique story. It's very unique to me. But all of us have things that we struggle with. All of us have something we came in this room with that we think if people knew this about me, they just would love me less, or they would think about me differently, or I wouldn't be loved, I wouldn't be accepted. And so those are those places that we really want to keep other people out of and God out of. And I can promise you this, nobody else is going to have to come up here and talk about those places. It was uniquely my calling that I felt like, and many of you who've been in this church, I've shared pieces of this story before, and it's not like it's the only thing I share. There's lots of other dimensions, but it is uniquely part of who God made me, and uniquely part of where I felt such great shame. And so here's the thing, is that we think whatever problems we're dealing in life with, that they're worse than God's goodness or God's power. Like if you had asked me, I would have told you, I know God changed my life. And I felt forgiven. For my sin, I'd never felt shame before God. But I did feel that among people, among man. And it made me hold back something that God wanted. And he had to press it out of me. And I knew immediately that that would be part of why I was in Gainesville. So for me to not share it with you would not be surrendering to what God wants for me. And I really question God's goodness and that, God, that's so hard. Please don't make me do that. It's so hard. I don't want to share. And I don't want people to look at me different. I don't want to be different, right? I want to be the same. I want to be like everybody else. I want to be like every other good pastor wife. And if you know me, you're like, there was no hope of that. But I knew God uniquely called me here to reshape that vessel. And then I had to go through the agony of telling my kids, and because I knew this is going to be public knowledge and I got to cover it with some people that are going to know it. And one of the things we want for this event every quarter, and I promise they're not going to be this heavy every time. I promise. I'm just kicking it off to a good start. Is that we want women who have stories of hope in Jesus to come share their story. And they can be of any age, of any variety, and all of us have unique stories, unique journeys that God has brought us on. And so I just ask of you all that you will surrender those parts. Now, Jay and the worship team are really worried because I have 6 more slides of Hebrews to go through. We're not going to go through them tonight. By the way, I'm going to teach on Hebrews again coming soon because if you're in my Bible study, you know everything always comes back to Hebrews for me. So it's the best book. I love it so much. But if you struggle at all with really understanding how much God has forgiven you and how much he doesn't want you to walk around with tight-fisted knuckles around those unique places of who God's made you, that Jesus' blood cleansed all of that, all of it. You can just read through Hebrews, and it talks about boldly coming into the presence of God. And when we feel shame and embarrassment, the last thing we feel like we can do is be bold and confident. And yet that's what the author of Hebrews tells us to do, because Jesus' sacrifice cleanses all our sin and everything that brought distance between us and God. And Jesus' blood did that for us. One sacrifice for all time. And he sat down at the right hand of the Father. And one of the beautiful things when you read through Hebrews that you realize is that all the sacrifices that they did in the Old Testament, all the dead animals that went through, the people who brought them as sacrifices for sin, they never felt better on the inside. There was no cleansing on the inside. But the beautiful thing about Jesus is that his blood, his cleansing, can give us a clean conscience. That's a miracle, y'all. That it's not just something that we have to keep doing over and over again. It's something that when we ask God to forgive us of something, or when we ask him to just take some piece of us and reshape it, we can leave it in his hands and let him do the work, because his blood paid the price for all those things.